Hello and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the golden age of Hollywood, that glittering era of glamour and sophistication we still romanticize today. But beneath the champagne and spotlights lay a machinery of exploitation so systematic, so calculated, that the rumors which escaped its walls seemed too dark to believe. For decades, they were dismissed as gossip, as jealous fiction, as the bitter fantasies of failed starlets. They were all true. Picture a young woman, 21 years old, sitting in a leather chair that makes her feel small. The office is larger than her family's entire apartment back in Nebraska. Behind the mahogany desk sits a man in an expensive suit, his fingers steepled, his smile practiced. The contract between them runs to 47 pages. She hasn't read it. Her mother, sitting beside her, hasn't read it either. They've been told it's standard. They've been told it's their dream come true. The year is 1935. The studio is Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful entertainment corporation in the world. The contract this young woman is about to sign will give MGM ownership of her name, her image, her time, her body, and effectively, her life for the next 7 years. If she's lucky, they'll renew it. If she's not, they'll destroy her so completely that no other studio will touch her. This wasn't unusual. This was the system. The studio system, as it came to be known, emerged in the 1,920 seconds and reached its terrible zenith in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds. 5 major studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, controlled not just film production, but distribution and exhibition as well. They owned the theaters, they owned the cameras, they owned the stories, and most devastatingly, they owned the people who appeared on screen. When an actor signed with a studio, they signed away rights that would be unthinkable today. The studio chose their name, often discarding their birth name entirely. They chose their hair color, their weight, their romantic partners, their public statements, their hobbies, their friends. Every aspect of an actor's life became studio property, managed and controlled by departments of handlers, fixers, publicists, and executives who viewed human beings as assets to be maximized. The contracts contained morality clauses that could be interpreted to mean anything the studio wanted them to mean. Pregnancy? Breach of contract. Marriage without permission? Breach of contract. Gaining weight? Breach of contract. Refusing a role, no matter how degrading? Breach of contract. And breach of contract meant suspension without pay, extension of the contract term, or outright termination followed by blacklisting across the industry. But the contracts were only the beginning. The real control came through the infrastructure built around each star. Every major actress and actor was assigned a handler, someone who monitored their daily movements, reported back to the studio, and ensured compliance with studio dictates. These handlers controlled access to the stars, approved their friendships, monitored their relationships, and reported any deviation from the carefully crafted public image the studio had created. The studio executives who built this system understood something fundamental about power. Total control requires total information, so they created elaborate surveillance networks. Handlers reported to publicists. Publicists reported to studio executives. Private investigators were kept on retainer to follow stars, photograph them, document their private lives. Hotel staff were paid to report on what happened in stars' rooms. Restaurant owners were cultivated as informants. Even the stars' own servants were often studio plants. This wasn't paranoia. This was policy. Studios like MGM under Louis B. Mayer operated with the efficiency of intelligence agencies. They knew who their stars saw, what they ate, what they drank, where they went, who they slept with, what medications they took, what secrets they kept, and they used this information ruthlessly to maintain control. The most chilling aspect of the system was its self-perpetuation. Young actors and actresses entered it willingly, desperately, seeing it as their only path to stardom, and they were right. The studios controlled the industry so completely that there was no alternative route to success. If you wanted to be a movie star in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, you sold yourself to the system. There was no other way, and the system was hungry. It needed a constant supply of fresh faces, new talent, young bodies to feed into the machinery of production. Talent scouts combed the country, visiting beauty pageants, theater productions, high school plays. They made promises. They painted pictures of glamour and wealth and fame. They rarely mentioned what it would cost. The young woman in the leather chair signs the contract. Her hand shakes slightly as she writes her name, her real name, for the last time in any document that matters. The executive behind the desk smiles. He's done this hundreds of times. He'll do it hundreds more. He slides another document across the desk. This one is shorter. It lists her new name, the name the studio has chosen for her. It's prettier than her real name, more exotic, more marketable. She signs this one too. Welcome to Hollywood. Welcome to the machine that made dreams. Welcome to the most sophisticated system of human exploitation ever devised by the entertainment industry. For the next 7 years, she will belong to MGM more completely than any slave ever belonged to a master, because at least slaves knew they were enslaved. She still thinks this is opportunity. To understand how this machine worked, we must start with the man who built it. Louis B. Mayer didn't invent Hollywood, but he perfected it. Born Lazar Mayer in a shtetl in the Russian Empire, he arrived in America with nothing and built an empire through a combination of business acumen, ruthless pragmatism, and an absolute conviction that he knew what was best for everyone who worked for him. He called his contract players his children. He wept real tears when he spoke of his responsibility to them, and he controlled them with a totality that would have impressed a totalitarian state. At MGM, Mayer created what became the template for studio control. He understood that the morality clause that standard contract provision meant to protect the studio's investment from scandal could be weaponized into something far more powerful. Under Mayer's interpretation, anything could constitute a breach of morals. The clause became a sword held permanently over every actor's head, ready to fall at the studio's discretion. The morality clause in a standard MGM contract of the 1,930 seconds read in part: the artist agrees to conduct himself with due regard to public conventions and morals, and agrees that he will not do or commit any act or thing that will tend to degrade him in society, or bring him into public hatred, contempt, scorn or ridicule, or that will tend to shock, insult or offend the community, or ridicule public morals or decency, or prejudice the producer or the motion picture industry in general. Every word of that clause was deliberately vague. What constituted public morals? What would shock the community? Who decided? The studio decided. Always the studio. The clause gave MGM the legal authority to dictate every aspect of a performer's life, public and private, and to destroy anyone who resisted. But legal authority was only the beginning. Mayer built an infrastructure to enforce that authority. At the heart of this infrastructure were the fixers' men, whose job was to make problems disappear before they became scandals. Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling became the most powerful fixers in Hollywood, and they worked exclusively for MGM. They had police on their payroll. They had journalists in their pocket. They had private investigators, doctors, lawyers, and judges. who could be called upon to help the studio's interests. These fixers did more than cover up scandals. They created the reality the public saw. They arranged dates between stars to generate publicity. They planted stories in fan magazines. They paid witnesses to lie or to stay silent. They threatened reporters who wrote unflattering stories. They made evidence disappear. They convinced coroners to change cause of death determinations. They were, in effect, the secret police of a corporate state. The control extended to the most intimate aspects of performers' lives. Pregnancy was a particular obsession of the studios. A pregnant actress couldn't work in the glamorous roles the studios had created for her. Pregnancy meant lost production time, lost revenue, lost opportunity. So pregnancy became, effectively, a breach of contract. Studio doctors, physicians kept on retainer by MGM performed abortions on contract players routinely. Some of these were requested by the actresses themselves. Many were not. The studio decided. A young actress might be told she was going for a routine medical checkup and wake up from anesthesia no longer pregnant. The paperwork would list the procedure as something else. The studio maintained plausible deniability. The actress was left to process what had been done to her body without her consent. But the studio's control over bodies went further. MGM maintained detailed records of every contract player's physical appearance, height, weight, measurements, coloring. Weekly weigh-ins were mandatory. An actress who gained even a few pounds could find herself suspended without pay until she returned to her assigned weight. The studio dietitians prescribed meals. The studio doctors prescribed appetite suppressants. The studio trainers supervised exercise regimens that bordered on abuse. And then there were the surgical alterations. Studios required contract players to undergo cosmetic procedures to conform to the studio's vision of what a star should look like. Noses were reshaped. Hairlines were altered through painful electrolysis. Teeth were pulled and replaced. Jawlines were modified. All of this was written into contracts or demanded under threat of suspension. The studios justified this control through a twisted kind of paternalism. Mayer genuinely seemed to believe he was protecting his stars from themselves and from the cruel world. He threw elaborate parties for contract players at his home. He gave expensive gifts. He cried at weddings and funerals. He played the role of benevolent father to hundreds of performers who had signed away their autonomy to work in his studio. But beneath the paternalism was cold calculation. Stars were investments. They were expensive to develop, market, and maintain. The studio had to protect its investment, and protection meant control. Total control. A star who married without permission might choose loyalty to a spouse over loyalty to the studio. A star who gained weight might become unmarketable. A star who got pregnant might miss crucial production schedules. A star who spoke freely to the press might say something that hurt the studio's image. So the studio controlled everything. Marriage required studio approval. Many contracts explicitly forbade marriage for the first several years. When marriage was permitted, the studio often chose the spouse, arranging unions between contract players for publicity purposes. The studio controlled where stars lived, often requiring them to maintain residences in specific neighborhoods that matched their public image. The studio controlled what cars they drove, what clothes they wore in public, what parties they attended, what charities they supported. Even more intimate choices were subject to studio control. Sexual relationships had to be approved or at least acknowledged by the studio. Homosexual actors were forced into heterosexual marriages to protect their marketability. Heterosexual actors were sometimes prevented from marrying their actual partners and forced into publicity relationships instead. The studio decided who you could love, how you could love them, and whether that love could ever be acknowledged publicly. The most chilling aspect of the Mayer method was how completely it worked. For nearly 3 decades, MGM operated this system of total control with barely any public knowledge of its mechanisms. The stars smiled for the cameras. They gave carefully scripted interviews. They lived in the houses the studio chose, wore the clothes the studio provided, married the people the studio approved, and if they resisted, the studio destroyed them so efficiently that other stars learned to never resist at all. The pills came in the morning with breakfast. Small white tablets, distributed by the studio nurse, handed to performers with a glass of orange juice and a smile. They were called pep pills, energy supplements, vitamin boosters. They were amphetamines, and by the mid-1930s, they were as much a part of the daily routine at MGM as hair and makeup. The studio system demanded impossible schedules. Filming might begin at 5 in the morning and continue past midnight. A star might be required to shoot one film during the day and another at night, moving between sets with barely enough time to change costumes. Musical numbers required dozens of takes. Dance sequences might be repeated 50, 60, 70 times until the director was satisfied. No human body could sustain this schedule naturally, so the studios made sure the bodies weren't functioning naturally. The drug regimen was systematic and carefully calibrated. Amphetamines in the morning to provide energy and suppress appetite. More amphetamines at midday to maintain the pace. Barbiturates in the evening to counteract the amphetamines and allow sleep. More barbiturates if sleep wouldn't come. Then amphetamines again the next morning to wake up after inadequate rest. The cycle repeated daily, weekly, monthly. For years, studio doctors prescribed these medications freely. They were legal, after all. Amphetamines and barbiturates could be prescribed for any number of legitimate medical reasons, and the studio doctors were creative in their diagnoses. Fatigue, nervousness, mild depression, insomnia, all could justify prescriptions. The fact that the studio's production schedule caused these conditions in the first place was never acknowledged. Dr. Lee Siegel became known in some circles as the studio doctor most willing to prescribe whatever the studios needed. His office on Sunset Boulevard saw a steady stream of MGM contract players, all leaving with prescriptions. The records that survived show a staggering volume of controlled substances flowing through his practice. In a single year in the late 1930s, he wrote over 400 prescriptions for amphetamines to fewer than 50 patients. The math was simple and horrifying. But the most documented case, the one that would eventually expose the entire system, was Judy Garland. Born Frances Gum, she was signed by MGM at 13 years old. By 14, she was being given amphetamines daily. The studio needed her alert and energetic for the grueling production schedule of the Andy Hardy films, and eventually The Wizard of Oz. They needed her thin, because the camera added pounds, and because she was being filmed alongside adults who made her look stocky by comparison. So they gave her pills, multiple times a day. The amphetamines suppressed her appetite and kept her working through exhaustion. When she couldn't sleep, they gave her barbiturates. When she couldn't wake up from the barbiturates, they gave her more amphetamines. By the time she was 16, Judy Garland was chemically dependent on drugs that had been forced on her by the studio that claimed to be protecting her. The amphetamines had other useful effects from the studio's perspective. They suppressed appetite dramatically, making it easier to maintain the tiny waistlines and low body weights the studios demanded. An actress taking amphetamines might eat almost nothing for days and feel no hunger. The weight would fall off. The studio dietitians monitored the results approvingly, that the performers were slowly destroying their metabolisms, their hearts, their nervous systems. This was not the studio's concern. The concern was whether they looked good on camera today. Mickey Rooney, Garland's frequent co-star, was also fed amphetamines as a teenager. He was a naturally energetic young man. But natural energy wasn't enough for the production schedules MGM demanded. The Andy Hardy series required rapid production turnaround, sometimes a complete film in less than 3 weeks. Rooney worked constantly, often on multiple projects simultaneously. The pills kept him going. Years later, he would describe the studio as a factory that ran on speed and sleeping pills. The pharmaceutical control extended beyond the major stars. Chorus girls, bit players, extras, anyone under contract might find themselves offered pills by the studio nurse or a sympathetic assistant director. The pills were presented as help, as support, as the studio taking care of its people. And in a culture where refusing the studio's help could mean the end of your career, people took the pills. The long-term effects were catastrophic. Addiction developed quickly with daily amphetamine use. Tolerance built up, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. Withdrawal caused severe depression, fatigue, and sometimes suicidal ideation. But the studios had a solution for withdrawal: more pills. The only acceptable reason to stop taking amphetamines was to switch to a different stimulant. The barbiturates were equally dangerous. They were physically addictive, and withdrawal could be fatal. Overdose was easy. The difference between a dose that induced sleep and a dose that stopped breathing was frighteningly small. But the studios needed their stars to sleep, needed them to be able to shut down after 16 hours of amphetamine-fueled work. So the barbiturates flowed as freely as the stimulants. Some performers developed elaborate personal pharmacies, carrying multiple types of pills for different situations. A few actresses kept color-coded pillboxes, different colors for morning, afternoon, evening. Emergency energy, forced sleep. They joked about it sometimes, trading pills like baseball cards, comparing notes on which combinations worked best. The humor was a defense mechanism against the reality that they were all being slowly poisoned by the companies they worked for. The studios maintained plausible deniability. The pills were prescribed by licensed physicians for legitimate medical purposes. If a performer became addicted, that was a personal failing, a weakness of character. The studio had only tried to help, that the help was mandatory, that refusing it could end a career, that the studio's production schedules created the need for the pills in the first place. None of this appeared in the official record. By the 1,940 seconds, the pharmaceutical dimension of studio control was so normalized that performers entering the system simply expected it. New contract players were told by established stars to take whatever the studio nurse gave them. It was presented as professional advice, the wisdom of experience. This is how it works here. This is how you survive. Take the pills. Do the work. Try not to think about what it's costing you. The physical toll mounted invisibly. Hearts strained by years of stimulant use. Livers damaged by barbiturate metabolism. Metabolisms permanently disrupted. Nervous systems rewired by years of chemical manipulation. The beautiful young people who signed contracts at 18 or 20 would find themselves at 30 looking 40, their bodies aged beyond their years by the systematic chemical abuse the studios called medicine. There was an actual couch. It sat in an office on the lot at Columbia Pictures, in a room that could be locked from the inside, in a building where everyone knew what that locked door meant. The couch was leather, dark brown, positioned beneath a painting of a pastoral scene that seemed deliberately ironic given what happened beneath it. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't euphemism. This was furniture purchased for a specific purpose, placed in a room designed for sexual coercion, used regularly by men who wielded life or death power over women's careers. Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, made no secret of his practices. His office setup was infamous throughout Hollywood. The couch, the door that locked, the intercom he would turn off before calling a young actress in for a private meeting. And knowing changed nothing, because Cohn controlled Columbia completely. and Columbia was a major studio, and working at Columbia meant accepting Cohn's system. The system worked through carefully maintained terror. A young actress would be called to Cohn's office, usually in the late afternoon when most staff had left. She would be offered a drink. She would be asked to sit on the couch. And then Cohn would make his intentions clear. If she complied, she might get a better role, more screen time, consideration for a contract. If she refused, she would be blacklisted not just at Columbia but industry-wide. The studio heads communicated. They shared information. They protected each other. Many women refused anyway. Their names disappeared from cast lists. Their contracts were terminated or allowed to expire. Agents stopped returning their calls. Suddenly, mysteriously, every studio in Hollywood simultaneously decided they weren't right for any roles. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This was documented practice. The studios maintained shared lists of difficult performers, people who had refused sexual advances, people who had complained about working conditions, people who had violated the unwritten rules of studio cooperation. At 20th Century Fox, Darryl F. Zanuck operated a similar system. His office included a private bathroom and an adjoining rest area. Actresses would be called for what they were told would be script readings or informal auditions. Zanuck would lock the door. The script reading would transform into something else entirely. Like Cohn, Zanuck faced no consequences for decades of sexual coercion. His behavior was an open secret in an industry built on open secrets. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from Shirley Temple. At 12 years old, already a massive star, she was brought to a meeting with an MGM producer. The meeting was ostensibly about a potential role. The producer exposed himself to her. Temple, with the self-possession that had made her a star, laughed at him and left. She was able to leave because she was Shirley Temple, because her career was already established, because her earning power gave her protection most women didn't have. She reported the incident. Nothing happened to the producer. Temple never made a film at MGM. The stories accumulated over decades, dozens of actresses, hundreds of incidents. Some women spoke about it privately, in whispered conversations with other women who had experienced similar situations. Most stayed silent, bound by shame, by fear, by the knowledge that speaking up would end their careers more surely than the assault itself had. The legal departments at the studios existed partly to handle these situations. When a woman did try to report sexual assault or file a lawsuit, the studio lawyers would arrive with a practiced routine. First, they would question her character. Had she been alone with the man voluntarily? What was she wearing? Had she been drinking? Then they would remind her of the morality clause in her contract. Anything that caused scandal or brought negative attention to the studio could be grounds for termination. Filing a lawsuit would certainly cause scandal. Finally, they would offer money, usually combined with a non-disclosure agreement. Most women, faced with this machinery of institutional defense, took the money and the silence it bought. The actresses who became stars despite refusing the couch were remarkable for their rarity. Joan Crawford, by multiple accounts, refused Cohn at Columbia early in her career and survived through a combination of determination and political maneuvering with other studio executives. Katharine Hepburn's established stage career and family wealth gave her leverage other women lacked. Barbara Stanwyck was direct to the point of confrontation, and her talent was so evident that even predatory executives ultimately decided her value as a performer outweighed their desire for sexual access. But for every woman who survived refusal, dozens more disappeared into obscurity. They took jobs as secretaries, or married and left the industry, or simply faded from view. Some dealt with what had happened to them by reframing it as voluntary. They had made a choice. They had done what they needed to do to get ahead. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying the shame and violation in silence until death. The men who perpetrated this system lived comfortably and died respected. Cohn died of a heart attack in 1958 and was eulogized as a creative genius. Zanuck worked into his 70s and received Lifetime Achievement Awards. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the organization that gives out the Oscars, honored these men repeatedly. Buildings at studios were named after them. Their contributions to cinema were celebrated, while their crimes were ignored. The younger women entering the system were often warned, in sideways fashion, by older actresses. Don't meet with him alone. Bring someone with you. Make sure the door stays open. Tell your agent where you're going. These warnings were necessary because the system continued, year after year, with only the names changing. When Cohn died, someone else took his office and his couch. The furniture remained. The practice remained. What made this particularly insidious was how it corrupted the entire concept of merit. When advancement could be gained through sexual compliance, genuine talent became secondary. Women who succeeded were assumed to have slept their way to the top, regardless of their actual behavior. Women who failed could believe they failed because they refused, even if their lack of success had other causes. The casting couch poisoned the industry's ability to recognize and reward genuine ability. The system thrived on isolation. Each woman who went into that office believed she was alone. She didn't know how many others had faced the same situation. She didn't know that refusal was possible. She didn't know that the shame she felt was manufactured. A tool of control wielded by men who understood that shame kept women silent. If the women had been able to speak to each other, to organize, to collectively refuse, the system might have collapsed decades earlier. But the studios kept them separated, kept them competing, kept them believing that their individual experiences were aberrations rather than features of the system itself. Jackie Coogan was 6 years old when he became a star in Charlie Chaplin's film, The Kid, in 1921. By the time he was 7, he was earning $22,000 per week, equivalent to over $300,000 today. By the time he was 21 and legally able to control his own finances, he discovered that his mother and stepfather had spent nearly all of the $4 million he had earned as a child. The money that remained was less than $250,000, and even that was only recovered after a bitter legal battle. The Coogan case would eventually lead to the California Child Actors Bill, better known as the Coogan Law, which required that a portion of child actors' earnings be placed in trust. But the law didn't pass until 1939, and even then, it was riddled with loopholes and poorly enforced. And it did nothing to address the other ways the studios exploited child performers: the grueling schedules, the mandatory medications, the complete absence of meaningful education, the psychological damage inflicted by treating children as commercial products. Child labor laws in 1,932 California were minimal and easily circumvented. Studios were supposed to provide 3 hours of schooling per day for child performers during the school year. In practice, this often meant a tutor sitting in a corner of the set while the child worked, occasionally calling them over for a few minutes of instruction between takes. The education requirements existed on paper and nowhere else. Studio teachers were paid by the studios and knew that being too strict about enforcing education requirements was a quick way to lose their jobs. But the lack of education was the least of what was done to child performers. The production schedules were designed for adults and applied to children without modification. Judy Garland, signed by MGM at 13, regularly worked 12 to 16-hour days. When The Wizard of Oz went into production, she was 16 years old and being given amphetamines to maintain energy through the demanding shoot. The studio justified this by claiming that the pills were prescribed by a doctor for legitimate medical purposes. That the doctor was paid by the studio was not considered relevant. Mickey Rooney entered the system even younger. Born in 1920, he was performing in vaudeville as a toddler and making films by age 6. By his teenage years, he was MGM's most bankable star, churning out Andy Hardy films at a breakneck pace. The studio schedule allowed for minimal time between productions. A film would wrap, and the next would begin immediately. Rooney worked constantly, sustained by amphetamines, with no adult protecting his interests except the studio itself, which had a financial incentive to extract maximum productivity from him regardless of the cost to his health or development. The mothers of child stars became legendary, and not in a positive way. Stage mothers were often the driving force behind their children's careers, and studios exploited this dynamic ruthlessly. A mother who was dependent on her child's income for the family's lifestyle had every incentive to keep the child working, no matter what the studio demanded. Studios cultivated these relationships, often paying the mothers directly for their cooperation. When the studio needed a child to work extra hours, the mother could be counted on to grant permission. When the studio needed to give a child medication, the mother would consent. Some mothers went further, spending their children's earnings on their own lavish lifestyles. The legal framework made this possible. Until the Coogan Law passed, parents had complete control over their children's earnings. A child star might make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and see none of it, with their parents spending it as they saw fit. Even after the Coogan Law theoretically protected 15% of earnings, enforcement was lax. Parents found ways around the requirements. Studios helped them find those ways. The studios also manipulated children's birth dates to circumvent even the minimal protections that existed. Birth certificates could be altered. A 9-year-old might be listed as 11 to allow longer working hours. A 15-year-old might be listed as 18 to avoid child labor restrictions entirely. Studios maintained relationships with officials who would produce the necessary paperwork. The children themselves often didn't know their real ages had been changed. The physical toll on child performers was severe. The combination of long hours, inadequate sleep, poor nutrition, and in many cases, medication created health problems that would persist into adulthood. Children developed ulcers, anxiety disorders, depression. Their growth was sometimes stunted by the appetite suppressants they were given to maintain tiny sizes for costumes. Their social development suffered from isolation. Child stars worked instead of playing, were educated minimally instead of attending real schools, and interacted primarily with adults who viewed them as sources of revenue. Carl Alfalfa, Switzer of our gang, became a child star at age 7. His contract with Hal Roach Studios paid him very little despite his prominent role in a commercially successful series. When the series ended and his film career faded, he struggled to transition to adult roles. The typecasting was absolute. Casting directors saw Alfalfa, not Carl Switzer. He took odd jobs, struggled with money, and died at age 31, shot in an argument over a small debt. His story represented the fate of many child stars used up young, discarded when no longer profitable, unable to build normal lives after childhood spent as commodities. The psychological manipulation of child performers was sophisticated and cruel. Studios understood that children were more compliant than adults, more easily convinced that bad treatment was normal. A child who had never experienced anything but the studio system had no basis for comparison. When told that 12-hour days were standard, that taking pills was normal, that having no real friends outside work was just how it was for special people like them, many children believed it. The studio became their entire world, and the studio's version of reality became their reality. Some child performers managed to escape with their mental health relatively intact, usually because they had parents who genuinely protected them, or because they exited the system early enough to have some childhood left. Shirley Temple's mother, despite being a classic stage mother in some respects, did set some boundaries with studios. Temple retired from full-time film work at 22 and built a successful adult life outside entertainment, but she was the exception. Most child stars either crashed spectacularly or faded into quiet obscurity, their childhoods sacrificed to an industry that viewed them as miniature adults with no special needs or protections. The studios faced no consequences for any of this. When child stars developed problems, addiction, mental illness, financial ruin, it was framed as personal failure, not systematic abuse. The narrative became about the curse of child stardom, as if the outcomes were mysterious and inevitable, rather than the predictable result of treating children as commercial products. The studios that had worked these children 16 hours a day, drugged them, stolen their earnings, and denied them education were never held accountable. They simply moved on to the next crop of children, the next generation of talent to feed into the machine. Rita Hayworth was born Margarita Carmen Cancino, the daughter of Spanish dancers. She had dark hair, a low hairline, and features that Columbia Pictures decided were too ethnic for stardom, so they changed her. The transformation was systematic and painful. Electrolysis removed her hairline, pushing it back more than an inch. Each hair was burned away individually over the course of a year. The sessions were excruciating. She was told not to cry because it would interfere with the procedure. Her hair was dyed from dark brown to auburn. Her name was changed to something that sounded less Spanish, less foreign, more acceptable to audiences who weren't ready to embrace Latina sexuality, but would embrace the same woman packaged as a white redhead. Rita Hayworth became one of the most iconic beauties of Hollywood's golden age. Margarita Cancino was erased so completely that most of the public never knew she had existed. This wasn't unusual. This was the process. Studios viewed contract players as raw material to be refined, shaped, and perfected according to the studio's vision of marketability. Every physical characteristic was subject to modification. If your nose was too large, it would be surgically reduced. If your teeth weren't perfect, they would be pulled and replaced. If your ears protruded, they would be pinned back. If your chin was too weak, it would be augmented. The studios employed full-time cosmetic surgeons who specialized in creating the studio's preferred aesthetic. The most disturbing aspect of these procedures was how often they were performed without genuine consent. A young actress under contract would be told that a certain procedure was necessary for her career. The alternative to compliance was suspension or termination. When your entire future depends on the studio's approval. When saying no means losing everything you've worked for, consent becomes a legal fiction. Many actresses were presented with surgical modifications as fait accompli. This is happening. We've already scheduled it. Your only choice is whether you want to keep working here afterward. The MGM smile became infamous among performers. Studio executives believed that large, prominent teeth photographed poorly, so they developed a solution. Remove the back teeth, creating a hollow in the cheeks that supposedly created better facial contours on camera. Performers would have healthy molars extracted for purely aesthetic reasons. The procedure was painful and permanent. It changed the structure of their faces. Some performers developed long-term dental problems as a result, but their smiles photographed well, and that was what mattered to the studio. Joan Crawford underwent this procedure early in her career. She rarely spoke about it, but other actresses who knew her confirmed the story. Crawford had been born Lucille LeSueur in Texas, and MGM rebuilt her into their vision of a sophisticated movie star. The teeth were only part of it. Her eyebrows were completely removed and redrawn in a different shape. Her hairline was altered. Her weight was micromanaged. By the time MGM finished with her, Lucille LeSueur had been completely erased, replaced by Joan Crawford, a creation of the studio system. Weight control was perhaps the most pervasive form of body modification. Every contract included weight requirements. An actress might be required to maintain a weight of 110 pounds regardless of her height or natural body type. Weekly weigh-ins were mandatory. Gaining even 2 or 3 pounds could result in suspension without pay. The studio would prescribe extreme diets, sometimes as few as 500 calories per day. They provided appetite suppressants. They employed dietitians who specialized in rapid weight loss through methods that would be considered dangerous by any modern medical standard. The psychological impact of this constant monitoring was severe. Many actresses developed eating disorders. Some became addicted to the appetite suppressants the studios provided. Others developed obsessive behaviors around food and weight that persisted long after their film careers ended. The studios created a culture of body dysmorphia and disordered eating, then blamed the performers when they developed the predictable psychological consequences of being treated as objects whose value depended entirely on maintaining impossible physical standards. Male performers were not exempt from body modification requirements, though the pressure was less extreme. Leading men were expected to maintain certain builds. Hair loss was unacceptable. Studios provided early hair transplant procedures or required performers to wear hairpieces. Nose jobs were common for male performers as well. Height was obsessively managed. Actors wore lifts in their shoes, and taller actresses were required to slouch or stand in trenches during romantic scenes to preserve the illusion that their male co-stars were taller than they actually were. Marilyn Monroe's transformation illustrates the comprehensive nature of studio body modification. Born Norma Jean Mortensen, she had a slightly different nose, slightly different chin, somewhat darker hair, and a body that didn't quite match Hollywood's preferred proportions. The studios changed all of it. Her nose was refined through surgery. Her chin was augmented. Her hair was bleached to platinum. Her hairline was adjusted through electrolysis. She was put on weight control regimens to maintain specific measurements. Even her voice was modified. She was trained to speak in a breathy whisper that became her signature, but was entirely artificial. The before and after photographs of many stars revealed the extent of these modifications. The young women and men who entered the studio system often looked significantly different from the stars they became. This wasn't just makeup and lighting. These were surgical alterations, permanent changes to their bodies, made to conform to commercial standards of beauty that the studios themselves had created and promoted. Perhaps most disturbing was how these modifications were presented to the public. Fan magazines would run articles about stars' natural beauty, their effortless glamour, their genetic good fortune, the extensive surgical modifications, the painful procedures, the forced body alterations. None of this was mentioned. The public was encouraged to believe that these people were simply born beautiful, born perfect, naturally suited to stardom. The reality that they had been surgically and chemically altered to meet studio specifications remained hidden. Some performers later spoke about the psychological impact of having their bodies treated as studio property. They described feeling disconnected from their own physical selves, looking in mirrors and seeing a stranger, a creation that belonged to the studio rather than to them. The modifications were permanent, but the careers they enabled were not. When a star aged or fell out of favor, they were left with bodies that had been altered to meet standards they no longer met, marked permanently by decisions that had been made for them by executives who viewed them as products to be packaged and sold. Eddie Mannix arrived at the beach house at 3 in the morning. The police hadn't been called yet. The body was still warm. A young actress sat in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, her makeup smeared. A producer stood near the window, smoking, his hands shaking, and on the floor lay a man who had been very much alive 3 hours earlier when the party started. Now he wasn't, and Eddie Mannix's job was to make sure this scene never existed. This was the work of fixers, the men who cleaned up after the stars, who made inconvenient realities disappear, who ensured that what happened behind closed doors stayed there permanently. At MGM, Mannix and his colleague Howard Strickling ran what amounted to a private intelligence service. They had police on their payroll. They had coroners who would adjust findings. They had journalists who would kill stories. They had private investigators who could dig up dirt on anyone who became a problem. And they had the absolute backing of the studio to do whatever was necessary to protect MGM's interests. The job of a fixer was to make problems disappear before they became scandals. A star crashes their car while drunk. The fixer arrives before the police, drives the car away, arranges for the star to be elsewhere with witnesses who will swear they were never near the accident scene. A star gets into a violent altercation at a nightclub. The fixer pays off the victims, intimidates the witnesses, and ensures that no police report is ever filed. A star's homosexuality is about to be exposed. The fixer arranges a lavender marriage, plants stories about heterosexual romances, and ensures that the truth never surfaces. But the darker work, the work that crossed from public relations into criminality, involved covering up serious crimes. When Paul Byrne, married to Jean Harlow, died of a gunshot wound in 1932, MGM's fixers were on the scene before the police. The death was ruled a suicide. A note was produced. The investigation was perfunctory, but questions persisted for decades. Had it really been suicide? If so, why had MGM's fixers contaminated the crime scene before investigators arrived? What were they hiding? The answers remained buried in MGM's files, and the fixers took their secrets to their graves. Thelma Todd's death in 1935 provided another case study in how fixers operated. Todd, a successful actress, was found dead in her car in a garage, apparently from carbon monoxide poisoning. The death was ruled accidental, possibly suicide, but Todd had been involved in disputes with powerful men, including organized crime figures who wanted her to allow illegal gambling in her restaurant. She had refused. Then she died. The investigation raised more questions than it answered. Witnesses gave contradicting statements. Physical evidence didn't quite align with the official story. And throughout the investigation, studio fixers hovered in the background, managing information, controlling access to witnesses, ensuring that certain questions weren't asked too insistently. The fixers' power extended into law enforcement at the highest levels. The Los Angeles Police Department in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds maintained relationships with studio fixers that would be considered corruption by any modern standard. Police officers supplemented their income with studio money. In return, they provided advance warning of investigations, sanitized police reports, and looked the other way when studio interests were at stake. Certain detectives became known as studio-friendly. They could be counted on to handle cases involving movie stars with appropriate discretion. Coroners were similarly compromised. The cause of death determinations in cases involving Hollywood figures often defied logic. Obvious murders became suicides. Drug overdoses became natural deaths. Suspicious circumstances became unfortunate accidents. The medical examinations were cursory. The findings aligned conveniently with studio interests, and the coroners who cooperated found their careers and finances in good health, while those who asked too many questions found themselves transferred or pressured into early retirement. Journalists were managed through a combination of rewards and threats. Entertainment reporters depended on studio access for their careers. They needed interviews with stars, advance information about films, invitations to premieres. The studios controlled all of this access. A reporter who wrote unflattering stories would find themselves cut off. No more interviews, no more advance information, no more invitations. Their career would effectively end. So most reporters cooperated, writing the stories the studios wanted written and killing the stories the studios wanted buried. For reporters who couldn't be controlled through access, the fixers had other methods. Private investigators would dig into the reporter's personal life, looking for leverage, affairs, financial problems, youthful indiscretions, anything that could be used to pressure them into silence. If a damaging story was about to run, the fixer would visit the reporter with photographs, documents, evidence of their own secrets. The message was clear: publish this story and your secrets become public. Most reporters backed down. The George Reeves case in 1959 illustrated how far the fixer's influence extended even as the studio system was collapsing. Reeves, who had played Superman on television, died of a gunshot wound to the head in his bedroom. 3 people were in the house. The death was quickly ruled a suicide, but the evidence was troubling. The position of the body didn't match a self-inflicted wound. There were bruises consistent with a struggle. The witnesses gave statements that didn't align, and Reeves had been involved with the wife of a studio executive, a woman with connections to people who knew how to make problems disappear. The investigation was superficial. Questions weren't pursued. Alternative explanations weren't seriously considered. The official ruling stood. Whether Reeves killed himself or was murdered, the investigation was clearly compromised by the involvement of people with studio connections and the resources to manage what the investigation found. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried. Mannix and Strickling worked for MGM for decades, handling hundreds of crises, covering up countless scandals, making problems vanish with a combination of money, pressure, and connections. They operated with impunity because the studio backed them absolutely, and because the systems they worked within law enforcement, journalism, the coroner's office were sufficiently corrupt to allow it. They weren't aberrations. They were the logical consequence of an industry with unlimited money and no meaningful oversight, operating in a city where studio interests had captured the institutions that were supposed to regulate them. The fixers kept detailed records, at least initially, files on every star, documentation of every crisis managed, every body buried figuratively and perhaps literally. But those files were destroyed or disappeared over time. Studios cleaned their archives. Fixers burned their notes. The men who knew the truth died without writing memoirs. What survived were fragments, whispers, the cases where the cover-up wasn't quite complete enough, where witnesses talked decades later, where the official story had holes that couldn't be filled even with all the studio's resources. Rock Hudson married Phyllis Gates on the 9th of November 1955 in Santa Barbara, California. The wedding was covered extensively in fan magazines. The bride wore white. The groom looked handsome in his suit. They smiled for the cameras, kissed for the photographers, and played their roles perfectly. The marriage lasted 3 years. It was, from the beginning, a business arrangement designed to protect Hudson's career from the truth that everyone in Hollywood already knew: he was gay. This wasn't a secret Rock Hudson kept well in private. Within the industry, his homosexuality was common knowledge. He attended gay parties, had relationships with men, lived a life that was only closeted to the public, but that public closet was essential. In the 1,950 seconds, a gay actor couldn't be a leading man. The morality clauses in studio contracts explicitly allowed termination for homosexuality. The Hollywood Production Code, which governed film content, prohibited any positive or even neutral portrayal of homosexuality. And the audience, studios believed, wouldn't accept a gay man as a romantic lead. So the studios invented Lavender Marriages, arranged heterosexual marriages designed to provide cover for homosexual actors and actresses. These weren't marriages of love or even convenience. They were contracts, negotiated through agents and studio executives, with terms as specific as any business deal. The marriages would last a certain minimum time. The spouses would appear together at specified public events. They would give interviews about their happy home life. In return, both parties received career benefits and financial compensation. Phyllis Gates was Rock Hudson's agent's secretary. She may have known she was marrying a gay man, or she may have been deceived. Different accounts give different versions. What's clear is that the marriage was arranged by Henry Wilson, Hudson's agent, who specialized in managing the careers of gay actors. Wilson had a stable of handsome young men, all of whom he gave masculine-sounding stage names, all of whom he kept carefully closeted, and several of whom he married off to women in lavender arrangements. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor's marriage fit a similar pattern, though in their case it was mutual protection. Stanwyck's lesbian relationships were known within the industry. Taylor's homosexuality or bisexuality was similarly understood in Hollywood circles. Their marriage in 1939 benefited both of them, providing each with cover while allowing them to maintain their private lives discreetly. The marriage lasted 14 years, long enough to serve its purpose and deflect suspicion. The studios didn't just arrange these marriages, they manufactured entire false narratives around them. Fan magazines ran articles about the couple's courtships, their romantic dinners, their future plans for children. Publicity departments planted stories about passionate love affairs. The couples were photographed constantly at premieres, at parties, at home in carefully staged domestic scenes. The machinery of Hollywood publicity created an alternate reality in which these marriages were not just real, but ideally romantic. For the people trapped in these arrangements, the psychological toll was severe. They were required to live double lives with complete consistency. In public, they played devoted spouses. In private, they maintained their actual relationships, always with the fear that exposure would destroy everything. The strain of constant performance, of never being able to relax into authenticity, damaged many of them permanently. Some lavender marriages were more cruel than others. When the studio arranged a marriage between a gay actor and a straight woman who didn't know the truth, the deception created genuine trauma. Women who believed they were entering real marriages found themselves in relationships with men who could never love them as they expected to be loved. Some of these women spent years trying to fix what they perceived as problems with the marriage, not understanding that the marriage had been designed to fail in private while succeeding in public. The financial arrangements underlying these marriages were rarely discussed but always present. In some cases, the non-famous spouse was essentially paid to maintain the fiction. In other cases, both spouses were actors whose careers benefited from the arrangement. Contracts would stipulate how long the marriage must last, how often the couple must be seen together, what kinds of statements they could or couldn't make about each other. Divorce required negotiation and often required approval from the studios that had arranged the marriage in the first place. The lavender marriage industry had its coordinators, agents, and fixers who specialized in making these arrangements. They maintained lists of suitable candidates for marriage arrangements. They knew which gay actors needed cover and which women might be willing to participate. They negotiated the terms, drafted the contracts, and monitored compliance. It was an entire infrastructure built around maintaining lies. Not every gay actor participated in lavender marriages. Some resisted, choosing to remain unmarried and facing the career consequences. Montgomery Clift refused to marry despite enormous pressure from studios and his agents. His career suffered as a result not because he wasn't talented, but because studios were reluctant to invest in actors who wouldn't cooperate with the system of public deception. Clift's private life became the subject of constant speculation and gossip, precisely what the Lavender Marriages were designed to prevent. The actors who refused to hide paid steep prices. Those who were caught in homosexual relationships faced immediate termination of their contracts. Studios invoked morality clauses without hesitation. The blacklisting was industry-wide and permanent. An actor fired for homosexuality would never work in Hollywood again. The message was clear: hide successfully or lose everything. The tragedy of the Lavender marriage system extended beyond the individual suffering it caused. It reinforced the broader culture of homophobia that made such arrangements necessary. By creating elaborate public fictions of heterosexuality, the system sent a message that homosexuality was so shameful, so dangerous, that any deception was preferable to honesty. Gay actors and actresses learned that their authentic selves were unmarketable, unacceptable, disgusting. They learned that love had to be hidden and that the price of success was comprehensive dishonesty. Rock Hudson's story ended with particular cruelty. When he was dying of AIDS in 1985, his homosexuality became public knowledge. The revelation destroyed the carefully maintained fiction of his heterosexual identity. Phyllis Gates, his ex-wife, sued him, claiming she hadn't known he was gay when they married. The lawsuit forced public discussion of their marriage arrangement. Hudson died before the case was resolved, his final months consumed by legal battles over the lies he had been forced to live for his entire career. The Lavender Marriages continued into the 1960 seconds and beyond, though with decreasing frequency as social attitudes slowly shifted. But for the golden age of Hollywood, they were standard practice. One more way the studios controlled every aspect of their contract players' lives. The studios didn't just dictate who their actors could marry, they dictated who they could love, how they could love, and whether they could ever admit to the truth of their own desires. The marriages were contracts. The love was performance, and the cost was measured in decades of lives lived in hiding. The invitation described it as a sales convention. 120 MGM salesmen from across the country gathering in Los Angeles for a celebration of the company's success. The date was the 14th of May 1937. The location was a private club, and MGM, in what would later be described as standard practice for such events, hired young women to attend as entertainment. Patricia Douglas was 17 years old. She was a dancer, trying to build a career in Hollywood, taking whatever work came along. The job offer seemed straightforward: attend a party, dance with the salesman, be charming and friendly. She would be paid $10 for the evening. She needed the money. She took the job. The party began in the early evening. The salesmen were already drinking when the young women arrived. Alcohol flowed freely. The atmosphere became increasingly raucous. Patricia Douglas danced with several men. She accepted drinks. She tried to maintain the pleasant, professional demeanor she had been hired to provide. And then a man named David Ross told her he wanted to speak with her privately. What happened next was documented in court records, though the case would ultimately go nowhere. Ross took Patricia Douglas to a private room. He locked the door. He raped her. She fought. She screamed. No one came to help. When it was over, she was bleeding and in shock. Ross returned to the party. Patricia Douglas, traumatized and terrified, managed to leave the building and report the assault to police. This is where the story should have become a scandal that destroyed MGM. A major studio had hired young women, some of them teenagers, to serve as what amounted to party favors for its salesmen. One of those women had been raped at an MGM-sponsored event. The studio's responsibility seemed clear, but this was 1937, and MGM was the most powerful studio in Hollywood, and Patricia Douglas was a nobody with no resources and no protection. MGM's response was immediate and comprehensive. The studio hired private investigators to follow Patricia Douglas, to dig into her past, to find anything that could be used to destroy her credibility. They discovered she had posed for some photographs in a bathing suit. These were presented as evidence of loose morals. They found men she had dated and pressured them to sign statements about her character. They investigated her family, her friends, her employment history. The studio's lawyers went to work on the legal case. They filed motions to dismiss. They challenged every aspect of Patricia Douglas's testimony. They argued that even if something had happened, it wasn't MGM's responsibility. The salesmen were independent contractors, not employees. The party wasn't official MGM business. Ross was acting on his own. The studio constructed layers of deniability between itself and what had happened in that private room. Meanwhile, the private investigators escalated their campaign. They followed Patricia Douglas constantly. They intimidated witnesses who might have corroborated her story. They approached her family with threats and bribes. They made it clear that pursuing the case would mean total war against MGM's resources, and MGM's resources were functionally unlimited compared to what a 17-year-old dancer could marshal. The press, which might have exposed the story and created public pressure for justice, was largely silent. MGM controlled access to stars, to movie premieres, to the entire machinery of Hollywood coverage. Entertainment reporters who wrote unflattering stories about the studio found themselves cut off from their sources. The few journalists who did cover the case treated it as a she said, he said dispute, giving equal weight to Patricia Douglas's testimony and MGM's denials, as if the two sides had equal credibility and equal power. The case dragged through the courts for months. David Ross was eventually charged with rape. The trial, when it finally occurred, was a showcase of how effectively money and power could corrupt justice. The prosecution's case was undermined by witnesses who changed their stories, by evidence that mysteriously disappeared, by a defense team that had unlimited resources to challenge every claim. The jury acquitted Ross. Patricia Douglas's legal case ended in complete defeat, but the defeat went beyond the courtroom. MGM's private investigators had destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that she couldn't find work in Hollywood. Her name was poison. Casting directors who might have hired her were warned away. She had become an example. This is what happens to girls who make trouble for the studio. The message was received throughout the industry. Other young women who had been at that party, who might have testified about what they saw, stayed silent. The cost of speaking up was too high. The case revealed something darker than a single assault. It exposed a pattern. These sales conventions happened regularly. Young women were hired to attend them regularly. The expectation that these women would provide sexual services, either explicitly or implicitly, was understood by everyone involved. MGM and other studios treated women as part of the entertainment package they provided to business associates. Little different from the food and alcohol. Years later, other women came forward with stories about similar events. They described parties where they were hired ostensibly as dancers or hostesses, but where the expectation was clear. They were there for the men's pleasure, and refusal had consequences. Some were assaulted. Others managed to escape without physical harm, but understood clearly what had been expected of them and what would have happened if they had been less lucky or less able to get away. The Patricia Douglas case disappeared from public consciousness quickly. MGM ensured that. The studio's publicity machine buried the story. Fan magazines never mentioned it. The official histories of MGM, written years later, omitted it entirely. David Ross faced no lasting consequences. His career was unaffected. He continued working. He lived a long life. Patricia Douglas, meanwhile, left Hollywood entirely. She married, moved away, tried to build a normal life far from the industry that had used and discarded her. It wasn't until decades later, when researchers began examining court records and old newspaper archives, that the case resurfaced. By then, most of the people involved were dead. MGM itself no longer existed in its original form, but the documentation survived court transcripts, police reports, investigators' notes. The evidence showed clearly what had happened and how comprehensively the studio had worked to protect itself and its employee. The case stood as an example of how the studio system protected predators and punished victims. A 17-year-old girl was raped at an MGM event. She reported it. She tried to seek justice. And in response, one of the most powerful corporations in America deployed its resources to destroy her, to ensure that the man who raped her faced no consequences, and to send a message to every other woman in Hollywood about the cost of resistance. The party continued after Patricia Douglas left that night. The salesman kept drinking. The entertainment continued. The women who remained did whatever they felt they had to do to get through the evening safely. And MGM counted the night as a success, another convention, another celebration, another demonstration of the studio's power and largesse to its business partners. One girl's trauma was irrelevant compared to that. Peg Entwistle climbed the Hollywood sign on the 16th of September, 1932. She was 24 years old. She had come to Hollywood with hopes of stardom, had gotten one role in one film that went nowhere, and found herself unable to get another job. She climbed the maintenance ladder on the letter H, 50 feet up, and jumped. Her death became Hollywood's most famous suicide, the one that couldn't be completely buried because it happened on the town's most visible landmark. But Peg Entwistle was only one. Between 1,930 and 1,960, the suicide rate among Hollywood actors was significantly higher than among the general population, even after accounting for age and socioeconomic factors. The exact numbers were difficult to determine because the studios worked to ensure that suicides were recorded as accidents or natural deaths whenever possible. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The industry that sold dreams was killing the people who manufactured them. The official causes of death often told convenient lies. Drug overdoses were classified as accidental, even when suicide notes existed. Falls from buildings became unfortunate accidents. Single car crashes on empty roads were reported as mechanical failures. The coroners who determined these causes often had relationships with studio fixers. The death certificates were legal documents, but they were also fictions designed to protect the studio's reputations and their continued ability to profit from dead stars' images. Albert Decker's death in 1968 illustrated how far studios would go to sanitize ugly truths. Decker was found dead in his bathroom, bound, with obscene words written on his body, evidence suggesting autoerotic asphyxiation or something darker. The initial reports called it suicide. Later accounts called it an accident. The truth was probably more disturbing than either official version. But the studio system had trained everyone involved in death investigations to reach for the most palatable explanation, the one that would cause the least scandal. Lupe Velez's death in 1944 spawned a myth that overshadowed the tragedy. The story went that she had tried to stage a beautiful death, but had instead died vomiting in the toilet, a grotesque end for a once glamorous star. The myth was cruel and almost certainly false. The reality was that Velez, pregnant and unmarried, had taken a massive dose of sleeping pills. She left a note. She chose death over the scandal and career destruction that would have followed if her pregnancy became public. But the myth served a purpose. It made her death into a joke, something to laugh at rather than examine too closely. The statistical reality was harder to hide than individual cases. Too many actors were dying young. Too many deaths occurred shortly after career setbacks or contract terminations. Too many involved drugs that the studios themselves had provided. Researchers who tried to study the phenomenon found their access blocked. Studio archives were closed. Medical records disappeared. Witnesses refused to talk. The industry protected its secrets, even from statistical analysis. The mental health crisis underlying the suicides was systemic and untreated. The studio system created psychological trauma through its normal operations. Young people were given addictive drugs, worked to exhaustion, sexually exploited, subjected to constant criticism of their bodies, denied normal social development, and taught that their value as human beings was entirely dependent on their appearance and marketability. Then they were discarded when they aged or fell out of favor. The surprise wasn't that so many killed themselves. The surprise was that any survived with their mental health intact. There was no support system. Therapy was viewed with suspicion by studios that feared actors might tell therapists things that could become scandals. Admitting to depression or anxiety was seen as weakness that could cost you your career. The studios wanted performers who could maintain the illusion of happiness, regardless of what was happening in their private lives. Mental illness, even when it was obvious, was ignored as long as the performer could still work. The young woman who jumped from the Hollywood sign had written in her suicide note that she hoped her death might bring her the fame that her life had not. It was a bitter commentary on the industry's values. Death, she understood, could be commodified just as life had been. And she was right, her suicide became famous while her work was forgotten. The industry that had failed to find use for her alive found endless use for her death, which became a cautionary tale repeated to new arrivals as a warning about the dangers of hope. Some suicides were barely acknowledged at all. Character actors, failed starlets, former child stars when they killed themselves. There were brief obituaries, if anything. Their deaths didn't threaten studio interests because they had no marketable image left to protect. They were allowed to die without the elaborate cover-ups afforded to bigger names. Their suicides were recorded honestly simply because no one cared enough to lie about them. The prescription drug overdoses were particularly troubling because the drugs had often been supplied by studio doctors. An actress would be given barbiturates to help her sleep after being given amphetamines to keep her working. She would build up tolerance, need higher doses, find herself dependent on chemicals that the studio controlled. When she overdosed, accidentally or intentionally, the studio's role in creating her addiction was never mentioned. The death would be ruled accidental. The studio's doctor would continue prescribing to other performers. Families of suicide victims faced pressure to accept official versions of events. A mother who insisted her daughter's death was murder, or who wanted to expose studio complicity in drug addiction, would find herself facing studio lawyers and private investigators. She would be offered money to stay quiet. If she refused the money, her reputation would be attacked. Evidence would be manufactured suggesting she had been a bad mother, that she had contributed to her child's problems. Most families, already devastated by loss, couldn't withstand this pressure. The suicides that did become public were often exploited for publicity. The studios weren't above using a dead star's suicide to generate interest in their final film or to sell fan magazines. The death would be reported breathlessly, with speculation about the reasons, with photographs of the grieving friends and family. Then, once the publicity value was exhausted, the death would be forgotten, and the pattern would continue. The pattern continued because nothing in the system incentivized change. The studios profited from driving performers to psychological breaking points, the exhausting schedules, the chemical dependencies, the constant pressure. These things extracted maximum short-term value from human beings. That some of those human beings responded by killing themselves was seen as an acceptable cost of business. There were always more young people arriving in Hollywood, ready to take their place, ready to believe that they would be different, that they would be the ones who made it. The mental health epidemic wasn't acknowledged until long after the studio system collapsed. Only when researchers gained access to archives, when survivors began writing honest memoirs, when the protective apparatus of fixers and studio lawyers was dismantled, did the scope of the crisis become clear. For every famous suicide, there were dozens of attempts that were covered up. For every documented mental breakdown, there were hundreds of performers suffering silently, medicating with studio-supplied drugs, barely holding together. The industry had built a machine that consumed people, and occasionally they didn't survive. The suicides were predictable outcomes of predictable pressures, but the studios never acknowledged responsibility, never changed their practices, never admitted that their business model required destroying the mental health of the people who made them rich. Frances Farmer was beautiful, talented, and uncooperative. She questioned authority. She spoke her mind in interviews. She refused to play the grateful starlet. She drank too much, missed appointments, argued with directors. In the studio system's calculus, this made her not just difficult, but dangerous. A star who wouldn't follow the rules set a bad example for other stars who might be considering rebellion. So the studios, working with her family, found a permanent solution to the Frances Farmer problem. The commitment papers were signed in 1944. Farmer was declared mentally ill and sent to Western State Hospital in Washington. The diagnosis was convenient and vague enough to justify institutionalization, not specific enough to require actual evidence of mental illness. Farmer protested. She insisted she was sane, but in the 1,940 seconds, a woman's protestations of sanity were often taken as proof of her mental illness. The more she insisted she didn't belong there, the more the doctors nodded and wrote notes about her lack of insight into her condition. What happened to Frances Farmer in Western State Hospital remained contested for decades. The hospital claimed she received standard treatment. Former patients and staff members told different stories of brutal conditions, experimental procedures, sexual abuse by staff. Farmer herself, after her release, gave conflicting accounts, sometimes claiming she had been treated reasonably, other times hinting at horrors she couldn't bring herself to describe fully. The question of whether Farmer received a lobotomy became particularly contentious. Her family denied it. The hospital denied it. No medical records survived that conclusively proved it, but Farmer's behavior after her release suggested profound neurological damage. The vibrant, rebellious actress who had been committed emerged years later as a docile, flat-affected woman who seemed to have lost some essential spark. Whether this was the result of a lobotomy, other procedures, or simply the trauma of years of institutionalization, the change was undeniable. But Frances Farmer wasn't the only actress who faced institutionalization for being difficult. The pattern was well established. A star becomes uncooperative, starts questioning the system, refuses to follow studio directives. The studio applies pressure. The star's behavior becomes more erratic, often because the studio has cut off access to the drugs the star has become dependent on, or because the stress of fighting the studio is overwhelming. The star's family is approached with concerns about mental health. The family, worried and often financially dependent on the star's income, agrees to commitment. Once committed, the star is effectively removed from the board. Their contract can be terminated, their roles can be recast, and they serve as a warning to other performers about what happens when you fight the system. The studios maintain plausible deniability. They were just concerned citizens trying to help a troubled individual. That they benefited enormously from that individual being locked away was presented as unfortunate coincidence. The psychiatric institutions that accepted these commitments weren't neutral medical facilities. They were businesses that relied on patient fees. A wealthy actress committed by her family represented significant revenue. The institutions had financial incentive to keep patients committed, as long as possible, and in the 1,940 seconds, the standards for holding someone against their will in a psychiatric facility were minimal. A family member's signature, a doctor's diagnosis, and you could be locked up indefinitely. The treatments available in these institutions were brutal even by the standards of the time. Insulin shock therapy involved inducing repeated comas through insulin overdoses. Electroconvulsive therapy sent high-voltage electrical currents through the brain, causing seizures and often permanent memory loss. Hydrotherapy meant being restrained in ice baths or scalding water for hours. These procedures were performed without meaningful consent, and often without even explaining to the patient what was being done to them. The lobotomy, though, was the ultimate weapon in the psychiatric arsenal. The procedure involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, theoretically to alleviate mental illness. In practice, it created docile, emotionally flat individuals who were easier to manage, but whose personalities were fundamentally altered. The procedure was irreversible. Once performed, the patient would never be the same person again. Dr. Walter Freeman became the most prolific lobotomist in America, performing thousands of procedures. His technique was quick. He called it the ice pick lobotomy because it involved inserting an instrument resembling an ice pick through the eye socket into the brain. The procedure took 10 minutes. No operating room was required. Freeman performed lobotomies in his office, in hospital hallways, sometimes even in patients' homes, and he was evangelical about the procedure's benefits, promoting it as a cure for everything from schizophrenia to simple rebelliousness. Studios maintained relationships with psychiatrists who were willing to diagnose troublesome performers with convenient mental illnesses. A star who was breaking her contract through difficult behavior might suddenly be diagnosed with a condition requiring immediate institutionalization. The studio would express concern and support the family's decision. The star would disappear into an institution. When and if she emerged, she would be different, either broken enough to be compliant or damaged enough to be unemployable. The commitment process could be triggered remarkably easily. A single incident, a public outburst, a failed suicide attempt, even just persistent sadness could be enough for a studio to suggest that professional help was needed. The studio's doctors would provide assessments. The studio's lawyers would help the family navigate the commitment process. And throughout, the studio would position itself as caring and concerned, merely trying to help a troubled employee get the help she needed. Some performers who were institutionalized had genuine mental health problems, often caused or exacerbated by the studio system itself. Years of amphetamine and barbiturate use could cause psychosis. The stress of being constantly controlled could trigger breakdowns. The trauma of sexual exploitation could lead to severe depression or suicidal ideation. But rather than acknowledging the system's role in creating these problems, the studios used the resulting mental illness as justification for removing the performer from the system entirely. The families who signed commitment papers were often manipulated by studios. They would be told their daughter or son was in danger, was spiraling out of control, needed intervention. The studio would pay for the best care, the best facilities. What the families weren't told was that institutionalization often meant the end of their relative's career and income. Once committed, the performer's contract could be terminated. Once labeled mentally ill, the performer would struggle to get work, even after release. Frances Farmer's story became a cautionary tale within the industry, though the full truth remained buried for decades. She had been a rising star, beautiful and talented, with a promising career. She had been difficult, yes, but no more difficult than many male stars who faced no consequences for their behavior. And for that difficulty, she spent years locked away, subjected to treatments that may have included one of the most barbaric medical procedures ever widely practiced. When she was finally released, her career was over. She worked occasionally in television, appeared in small roles, but the woman who had once been a movie star was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be performing the role of Frances Farmer without quite remembering how the part should be played. The doctor's office was on a quiet street in Beverly Hills, in a building that looked like any other medical practice. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and current magazines. The receptionist was professional and discreet. Nothing about the exterior suggested that this was one of the busiest abortion clinics in Hollywood, performing dozens of procedures each month on actresses sent by the studios that employed them. This wasn't back alley medicine. These were licensed physicians in proper medical facilities, performing procedures that were illegal under California law, but were conducted with the full knowledge and financial support of the major studios. The doctors charged two rates: the regular rate for women who came independently, and the studio rate often discounted because the studios provided so much regular business. MGM maintained a list of approved physicians. When an actress under contract became pregnant at an inconvenient time, she would be sent to one of these doctors. Sometimes she would be told she was going for a routine examination. Sometimes she would be told directly that the studio had scheduled an abortion. Either way, the message was clear. The pregnancy was incompatible with her contract obligations, and the pregnancy would be terminated. Judy Garland's forced abortions became the most documented cases because she spoke about them years later in interviews and in conversations with friends who later went public with her stories. She was pregnant at least twice during her MGM years, possibly more times. Each time, the studio sent her to a doctor who terminated the pregnancy. Garland wanted children. She was married, but the studio's production schedule came first. Her body, like every other aspect of her life, belonged to MGM. The justification was always framed in terms of the actress's career. A pregnancy would interfere with filming. It would change her body in ways that might not be reversible. It would cost the studio money in delayed productions and altered schedules. The abortion was presented as being in the actress's best interest, protecting her career, her marketability, her future, that the actress might want the child, might choose pregnancy over her next film role, was not considered a relevant factor. Ava Gardner spoke about her abortions years later with a mixture of matter-of-factness and lingering pain. She had terminated multiple pregnancies during her Hollywood career, some of them while married to Frank Sinatra. The procedures were arranged by the studio, performed by doctors on the approved list, and presented as necessary professional decisions. Gardner's tone when discussing these experiences suggested a woman who had accepted the studio's logic at the time but came to question it later, when her childbearing years were past and she had no children. The abortion network extended beyond the major studios. Agents knew which doctors to recommend. Fixers had relationships with physicians who would perform procedures with no questions asked and complete discretion. Publicists knew how to explain an actress's sudden absence from a production illness, exhaustion, family emergency, anything but the truth. The infrastructure was comprehensive and efficient. The doctors who participated in this network were well compensated. The studio rate might be lower than what they charged private patients, but the volume made up for it. A doctor who performed abortions for MGM might see 2 or 3 studio-referred patients per week, every week. That was steady income, and it came with the added benefit of connections to powerful people who could help with other aspects of the doctor's career. Some of the procedures were genuinely requested by the actresses themselves. An unmarried actress facing pregnancy in an era when illegitimacy could end a career might be grateful for studio help in obtaining a safe, illegal abortion. But the line between assistance and coercion was often invisible. When your employer arranges an abortion and frames it as protecting your career, when refusing might mean suspension or termination, when you've been taught that your body is studio property, How can consent be meaningful in those circumstances? The contracts didn't explicitly mention abortion, but they contained language about maintaining your appearance and being available for work as scheduled. Studio lawyers interpreted these clauses broadly. Pregnancy violated the appearance clause. Taking time off for childbirth violated the availability clause. Therefore, terminating the pregnancy was required to maintain contract compliance. The logic was circular and comprehensive. The procedures weren't always safe, despite being performed by licensed physicians. Abortion was illegal, which meant there was no regulatory oversight of the doctors who performed them. If something went wrong, the actress couldn't report it without admitting to having obtained an illegal procedure. The doctors knew they operated with impunity. Some were careful and skilled, others were less so. Several actresses died from botched abortions during the studio era. The deaths were rarely reported as such. Hemorrhage became tragic natural causes. Infection became sudden illness. Perforated uterus became vague internal complications. The studios worked with coroners to ensure that death certificates didn't reveal illegal procedures. The doctors involved faced no consequences, and the system continued. The psychological impact of forced abortion was something the studios never acknowledged. An actress who wanted children but was forced to terminate multiple pregnancies suffered trauma that had no outlet. She couldn't speak about it publicly without admitting to illegal activity. She couldn't even speak about it privately without risking that information reaching the wrong people. The grief, the anger, the sense of violation, all of it had to be suppressed and hidden. The price list for abortions varied by provider and circumstance. A typical procedure might cost anywhere from $200 to $500 in 1,940 seconds money. A substantial sum, but one the studios paid without hesitation. For actresses paying privately, the cost was higher. The doctors knew that a desperate woman would pay whatever was asked. The illegality of the procedure meant there was no price regulation, no competition to drive costs down. Some doctors specialized in late-term procedures, which were more dangerous but sometimes necessary when an actress didn't realize she was pregnant until filming schedules made an earlier abortion impossible. These procedures carried higher risks of complications and death. The doctors charged accordingly. The studios paid. The pregnancies were terminated. The productions stayed on schedule. The clinic locations were distributed across Los Angeles, from Beverly Hills to less affluent areas. The higher-end clinics catered to stars and wealthy women. The cheaper clinics served chorus girls, bit players, and women from outside the industry. But they were all part of the same network, connected through referrals and shared knowledge of which doctors would perform the procedure and which would report you to authorities instead. The studios maintained detailed but carefully coded records. Expenses would be listed as medical consultations or routine procedures. The abortion clinic visits appeared in studio files as doctor's appointments. The paper trail existed but was deliberately obscure. Years later, when researchers gained access to studio archives, they found these records and decoded them, revealing the scope of the abortion network. The system operated for decades with minimal interference from law enforcement. Police knew what was happening. District attorneys knew. But prosecuting doctors who performed abortions on movie stars meant taking on the studios, and few officials were willing to do that. The studios had too much power, too much money, too many ways to make problems for people who became problems for them. When an actress finally escaped the studio system through contract expiration, through buying out her contract, through age making her unemployable, she often found herself unable to have children. Years of abortions had caused damage, scar tissue, infections that had been inadequately treated, physical trauma that had never properly healed. The studios had extracted everything from these women, including their ability to create the families many of them had wanted. The telegram arrived at Elia Kazan's home on a spring morning in 1952. It was a summons to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Kazan was one of Hollywood's most successful directors, responsible for films that had made studios millions. He had also, in his youth, briefly been a member of the Communist Party. HUAC wanted him to testify about his political past. More specifically, they wanted him to name other people who had been in the party with him. Kazan struggled with the decision for weeks. He consulted friends, lawyers, his conscience. Then he went to Washington and named 8 names people he had known in the group theater in the 1,930 seconds. People whose political affiliations were already known to HUAC from other testimony. He named them anyway. The committee praised his cooperation. The studios welcomed him back. His career continued. The people he named were destroyed. But Kazan's testimony wasn't isolated. It was part of a systematic campaign in which the studios used anti-communist hysteria to eliminate people they wanted gone, for reasons that had nothing to do with politics. The House Un-American Activities Committee provided cover, the Blacklist provided the mechanism, and the studios provided the names, the pressure, and the enforcement. The Hollywood Blacklist emerged from a meeting in 1947 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Studio executives gathered to discuss how to respond to HUAC's investigations. They issued a statement declaring that they would not employ communists or people who refused to cooperate with congressional investigations. The statement was framed as patriotism. It was actually a purge mechanism. The studios had long wanted ways to break contracts with expensive or difficult performers without paying penalties. The Blacklist provided that mechanism. A star who was demanding higher pay could be accused of communist sympathies. A writer who insisted on creative control could be called a fellow traveler. A director who was becoming too independent could be labeled a subversive. Once accused, the performer faced a choice: inform on others or lose everything. The naming of names became ritual. Those called before HUAC were asked to prove their patriotism by identifying other communists, other sympathizers, other people who had attended the wrong meetings or signed the wrong petitions. The committee already knew most of the names from FBI files and previous testimony. The naming served a different purpose. It broke people, turned them into collaborators, forced them to betray friendships and principles to save their careers. Some refused. The Hollywood 1010 writers and directors who declined to testify in 1947 went to prison for contempt of Congress. They served their sentences and emerged to find themselves unemployable. Other performers who refused to name names were simply added to the blacklist. No formal list existed on paper, but everyone in Hollywood knew who was on it. Studios wouldn't hire them, agents dropped them, projects disappeared. They became invisible overnight. The informers faced different consequences. They kept their careers, but they lost something else. Elia Kazan worked for another 50 years, won Oscars, was honored as one of cinema's great directors, but he was also the man who named names. When he received an honorary Oscar in 1999, half the audience refused to applaud. The betrayal outlasted the politics that had supposedly justified it. The studios used HUAC strategically. An actress who was demanding script approval could suddenly be investigated for having attended a Hollywood anti-Nazi League meeting in 1936. Never mind that the League had been a mainstream organization fighting fascism before the war. The association was enough to justify investigation. The investigation was enough to generate headlines. The headlines were enough to make the actress radioactive to studios. Her contract could be terminated for bringing negative publicity to the studio, invoking the morality clause. The political nature of the investigations was often a pretense. Sterling Hayden was pressured to testify not because HUAC particularly cared about his brief Communist Party membership, but because Paramount wanted out of his expensive contract. The studio made clear that if he testified and named names, his career would continue. If he refused, he would be blacklisted and unemployable. Hayden testified. He named names. He kept working. And he spent the rest of his life calling his testimony the most shameful thing he had ever done. The blacklist operated without due process or appeal. Someone would report that you had attended a meeting, signed a petition, made a statement that sounded sympathetic to communism. Your name would appear in red channels, a publication that listed alleged communist sympathizers in entertainment. Studios would drop you. Your agent would stop returning calls. Projects you were attached to would suddenly find other performers. There was no hearing, no chance to defend yourself, no way to prove your innocence. Some blacklisted performers found work under pseudonyms. Writers particularly could continue working if they fronted their scripts through friends who would claim authorship. But this meant working for a fraction of their previous pay, with no credit, always fearing exposure. Several blacklisted writers won Academy Awards for scripts they wrote under false names. They couldn't attend the ceremonies or claim their awards. The psychological toll was severe. Betraying friends destroyed people from the inside. Larry Parks, who named names after initially refusing, went into the hearing room, a confident man, and emerged broken. He described the experience as having torn something fundamental from his soul. His career continued briefly, but never recovered. He spent his remaining years in minor roles, his earlier success irrelevant compared to the memory of his testimony. The studios defended the blacklist as necessary patriotism. Studio executives testified that they couldn't employ communists because the public wouldn't support films made by subversives. This was largely fiction. The public cared about entertainment, not the politics of the people who made it, but the fiction served its purpose. It justified the purge. It allowed studios to eliminate expensive contracts and difficult performers while wrapping the whole enterprise in the flag. The blacklist extended beyond performers directly accused. Family members of blacklisted individuals found themselves unable to get work. Defense of blacklisted friends could get you blacklisted yourself. The fear spread through the industry. People stopped having political conversations. They stopped attending any meetings that might be monitored. They withdrew from civic engagement entirely because any political activity could be used against them. The enforcement was comprehensive. Private security firms maintained lists of suspected communists and sold their services to studios. The American Legion threatened boycotts of films employing blacklisted individuals. Insurance companies refused to bond productions featuring blacklisted performers, making it practically impossible to employ them, even if a studio wanted to. The machinery of the blacklist extended far beyond Hollywood itself. By the late 1952, the blacklist began to crumble. Otto Preminger publicly hired Dalton Trumbo, one of the blacklisted Hollywood 10, to write Exodus. Kirk Douglas did the same for Spartacus. The sky didn't fall. The public didn't boycott. The fiction that the blacklist was necessary patriotism became unsustainable, but the damage was permanent. Careers had been destroyed. Marriages had ended under the stress. Some blacklisted performers had committed suicide. Others had died prematurely from stress-related illnesses. The lucky ones rebuilt careers, often in television or abroad. The unlucky ones never worked again in their professions, spending their remaining years bitter and broken, their talents wasted, their lives derailed by a political purge that had been as much about studio power as about ideology. The studios never apologized. The informers, mostly, never apologized. The system that had weaponized anti-communism to serve corporate interests simply moved on to other methods of control when the blacklist became politically untenable. The people whose lives had been destroyed were expected to forget, to move on, to understand that it had all been necessary. Most of them never did. Jean Harlow collapsed on the set of Saratoga on the 29th of May, 1937. She had been working despite feeling ill for days, complaining of exhaustion and pain. The studio doctors had examined her and declared her fit to work. She was 26 years old. She had 11 days to live. The illness had been developing for weeks, possibly months. Harlow suffered from kidney disease, a condition that was treatable in 1937 if caught early and treated aggressively. But treatment meant stopping work, going to a hospital, taking time off from the production schedule. MGM had millions invested in Saratoga. Clark Gable was her co-star. The film was nearly complete. The studio needed her to finish it, so they kept her working. When she complained of feeling ill, the studio doctors gave her vitamin shots and told her she was just tired. When her symptoms worsened, swelling, extreme fatigue, difficulty breathing, they adjusted her medication but didn't suggest hospitalization. The production schedule was sacred. Everything else was secondary. Harlow's mother, a Christian scientist, believed that prayer and faith could heal all illness. The studio was aware of this. They used it, rather than insisting on proper medical care, which would have meant admitting that Harlow was too ill to work. They deferred to her mother's religious beliefs. The mother prayed. The studio kept filming. Harlow got worse. The collapse on set finally forced acknowledgement that something was seriously wrong. But even then, the response was calculated to minimize disruption. Harlow was taken to her home, not a hospital. A studio doctor visited but didn't insist on hospitalization. The delay continued for days while Harlow's condition deteriorated. Her kidneys were failing. Toxins were building up in her blood. She needed immediate, intensive medical care. She remained at home with her mother praying over her. Only when Harlow began losing consciousness was she finally taken to Good Samaritan Hospital. By then, it was too late. Her kidneys had failed completely. Uremic poisoning had progressed too far. The doctors at the hospital did what they could, but the treatable condition had become fatal through weeks of neglect. Harlow died on the 7th of June, 1937. The studio's response to her death was revealing. They immediately began crafting the narrative. Harlow had died from a sudden, unexpected illness. She had been under the best medical care. Nothing could have been done. Her mother's religious beliefs weren't mentioned in the official statements. The studio's role in keeping her working while she deteriorated wasn't discussed. The narrative presented her death as tragic but unavoidable. But people who had been on the set told different stories. They described Harlow looking visibly ill for weeks. They talked about her struggling to get through takes, needing multiple attempts for simple scenes because she couldn't concentrate or couldn't stay on her feet. They remembered her complaining of pain and being told by studio personnel that she just needed to push through. The production schedule had to be maintained. The studio had even filmed Harlow on her last days on set, when she was so ill she could barely stand. Those scenes exist in the completed film. You can see her looking pale and exhausted, her movements slow and pained. The studio could have scrapped those scenes and reshot them with a stand-in after her death. Instead, they kept them. They used footage of a dying woman because it saved money and time. After Harlow's death, MGM completed Saratoga, using a stand-in for the remaining scenes. The film was released and became a massive hit, earning more money than most of Harlow's previous films. People flocked to see it specifically because it was Jean Harlow's last film. The studio profited from her death more than from her life. The morbid publicity drove ticket sales. MGM made millions. The pattern that Harlow's death represented was clear to anyone willing to look. Stars were assets to be used until they stopped generating revenue. Health was relevant only to the extent that it affected productivity. When a star was ill but could still work, the studio would push them to continue working. When the illness became severe enough to interfere with work, the studio would manage the situation to minimize financial impact. Other cases followed similar patterns. Stars worked through serious illnesses, because studios wouldn't allow them to stop. The drugs that kept them functional, the amphetamines, the painkillers, the medications to mask symptoms, allowed the studios to extract more work from bodies that needed rest and treatment. Some stars survived this treatment, others didn't. The studios calculated that the revenue from keeping them working outweighed the risk of pushing them to death. Harlow's medical records, what survived of them, showed that her condition was recognized by studio doctors weeks before she was hospitalized. They had known she needed treatment. They had chosen to defer that treatment to keep her on the production schedule. When she finally became too ill to work, they had still delayed hospitalization, deferring to her mother's religious objections rather than insisting on medical necessity. The calculation was pure economics. The cost of hospitalizing Harlow and delaying production would have been significant. The cost of keeping her working until she collapsed was zero in the short term. That she might die from the delay was a risk the studio was willing to take. Stars could be replaced. Production schedules were harder to adjust. The publicity photographs taken during Harlow's final hospitalization were particularly grotesque. The studio arranged for photographers to visit her hospital room. They took pictures of her looking beautiful even as she was dying. These photographs were released to fan magazines with captions about her brave fight against illness. The magazines bought them. The public consumed them. No one mentioned that the brave fight had been made necessary by the studio keeping her working when she should have been receiving treatment. The studio's treatment of Harlow's death set a precedent. Future stars who died young would be handled the same way their deaths would be managed for maximum publicity value. Their illnesses would be framed as unavoidable tragedies, and the studio's role in their deterioration would be carefully obscured. The pattern repeated with other performers whose deaths could have been prevented if studios had valued health over productivity. William Powell, Harlow's fiancé, reportedly never forgave MGM for her death. He believed, correctly, that the studio had killed her through neglect and exploitation. But he kept working for MGM for years afterward, because that was the system. You swallowed your grief, your anger, your knowledge of what the studio had done, and you showed up for work. There was no alternative. Harlow was buried in a gown that cost thousands of dollars, in a coffin that was absurdly ornate, at a funeral attended by hundreds. The studio spared no expense on her death. They had spared every possible expense on keeping her alive. The priorities were clear and consistent. Harlow was more valuable dead than healthy. Her death generated publicity and ticket sales. Her health would only have cost money. The final irony was that Harlow's kidney disease, if treated when first diagnosed, would likely not have killed her. The medical technology existed to treat kidney failure in 1937. The treatment would have required weeks of hospitalization and months of recovery. Harlow would have missed finishing Saratoga. The studio would have lost money on production delays. She would have lived. Instead, she died at 26. Her last days spent working on a film set while her body failed. Her death managed by the studio that had worked her to death for maximum publicity value. And when people remembered Jean Harlow, they remembered the platinum blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the movie star. They rarely remembered that she was a woman who died because the corporation that employed her valued her as a commodity more than as a human being. The studio system ended not with a reckoning, but with a whimper. The Supreme Court's decision in United States v. Paramount Pictures in 1948 forced the studios to divest their theater chains, breaking their vertical monopoly. Television emerged as competition. Independent production became viable. By the 1,960 seconds, the system that had controlled Hollywood for 3 decades was dissolving. The studios remained, but their absolute power over performers was gone. The executives who had built and maintained the system of exploitation retired wealthy and respected. Louis B. Mayer left MGM in 1951 after disputes with other executives. but he left with millions and a reputation as one of cinema's founding giants. Harry Cohn died in 1958 and received a funeral attended by hundreds of industry figures. Darryl F. Zanuck worked into the 1,970 seconds and received Lifetime Achievement Awards. The men who had enforced the morality clauses, arranged the forced abortions, enabled the sexual predators, and worked performers to death faced no consequences. The fixers died with their secrets. Eddie Mannix passed away in 1963, Howard Strickling in 1982. They never wrote memoirs. They never confessed. The crimes they had covered up, the evidence they had destroyed, the witnesses they had intimidated, all of it went to their graves with them. What survived were fragments, pieces of stories that leaked out over decades, enough to suggest the scope of what had been hidden, but not enough to provide complete accounting. The truth emerged slowly, incompletely, over generations, in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds. Some performers began writing honest autobiographies, breaking the silence that the studio system had enforced. Shelley Winters wrote about the casting couch. Ava Gardner discussed her abortions. These revelations were shocking to a public that had believed the carefully crafted studio narratives. But the revelations were selective and partial. Most performers took their full stories to their graves. The archives told more. Researchers gaining access to studio files decades after the fact found the paper trails, the coded expenses for abortion clinics, the contracts with private investigators, the memos about problem performers who needed to be handled, the correspondence with fixers about managing scandals. The documentation existed because the studios had kept meticulous records. They had never expected those records to become public. Legal settlements had buried much of the truth under non-disclosure agreements. Performers who had sued studios for mistreatment, families who had sought damages for deaths, women who had reported sexual assault. Many had settled their cases with agreements that prohibited them from speaking about what had happened. These NDAs survived the studio system itself. People died still bound by confidentiality agreements they had signed decades earlier, taking their testimony to their graves. The Me Too movement in the 2010 seconds revealed something unexpected. Many survivors were still alive, still silent, still afraid. When Harvey Weinstein's systematic sexual abuse became public in 2017, elderly actresses began sharing their own stories from the studio era. They described experiences identical to what Weinstein's victims reported: the hotel room meetings, the career threats, the industry protection of predators. The methods hadn't changed much in 70 years. Neither had the silence. These late testimonies confirmed what had been rumored for decades. The casting couch had been real. The forced abortions had happened. The drug distribution had been systematic. The fixers had covered up crimes. The studios had treated performers as property. But the confirmations came too late for justice. The perpetrators were dead. The studios that had employed them had been sold and resold, merged and restructured, until no institutional memory remained. There was no one left to hold accountable. Some archives remain closed. Studio files from the Golden Age contain materials that are still considered too sensitive to release. Legal departments advise that opening certain files could expose corporate liability for decades-old crimes. So the files stay sealed, their contents known only to a few researchers with special access, their full story unlikely to emerge while anyone involved is still alive to be damaged by revelation. The victims of the studio system mostly died in obscurity. The child stars who had been worked to exhaustion and drugged into compliance faded from public memory. The actresses who had been sexually exploited struggled through later years, often alone and poor. The performers who had been institutionalized carried their trauma silently. There were no apologies, no reparations, no public acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The popular memory of Hollywood's golden age remained stubbornly romantic. The public preferred to remember the glamour, the beautiful films, the stars who seemed larger than life, the machinery that had created that glamour, the human cost of those beautiful films, the suffering behind those larger-than-life personas. This was less marketable, less pleasant, less compatible with nostalgia. The studios themselves promoted this romantic memory. Anniversary celebrations focused on classic films and legendary stars. Documentaries emphasized creative achievement and cultural impact. The darker history was mentioned briefly, if at all, framed as isolated incidents rather than systematic practice. The narrative remained. Hollywood's golden age was a time of unmatched creativity and star power. The fact that it was also a time of institutional abuse was treated as unfortunate but incidental. Some attempts at historical correction emerged. Scholarly books documented the studio system's abuses. Documentaries interviewed survivors. Archive research revealed the paper trails. But these correctives reached limited audiences. The popular understanding of old Hollywood remained largely unchanged. People continued to romanticize an era that had been built on systematic exploitation. The irony was that the films themselves survived as the primary legacy. The movies that had been made through coercion and abuse, produced by studios that treated performers as commodities, became cultural treasures. People watched The Wizard of Oz without thinking about Judy Garland being drugged to maintain the production schedule. They watched Saratoga without knowing they were watching Jean Harlow work while dying. The art outlasted the memory of what it had cost to create. Hollywood itself moved on to new forms of exploitation. The studio system ended, but the power imbalances remained. Producers still held enormous power over performers' careers. Sexual harassment and assault remained endemic. Drug abuse continued. The methods evolved, but the fundamental dynamic, powerful people exploiting vulnerable people in pursuit of profit, persisted in different forms. The reckoning that never came wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about acknowledgement, about creating a historical record that didn't sanitize the past, about ensuring that the people who had suffered under the studio system were remembered as more than just names in credits. Most of them never got that acknowledgement. Their suffering remained largely invisible, overshadowed by the glamorous image the studios had spent so much effort creating and maintaining. The archives that are finally opening, the testimonies that survivors have begun sharing late in life, the research that's piecing together the full scope of the studio system's abuses, these are creating a more complete historical record. But for most of the people who lived through it, this record comes too late. They endured, they survived, or didn't, and they mostly died without seeing their stories become part of the official history. The Hollywood we romanticize was built on systematic brutality that would shock us in any other industry. The rumors that circulated for decades about drugs, about sexual coercion, about forced medical procedures, about covered-up crimes weren't rumors. They were survival strategies that became whispers, that became secrets, that became lies. They were all true, and now, perhaps, they can finally be history. Not a complete history, not a fully acknowledged history, but at least a documented one. The people who suffered under the studio system deserved better. They deserved justice, accountability, and recognition. Most of them got none of that. The least we can do now is remember accurately what was done to them.